All right. Excellent. Okay, folks. Thanks everyone for your patience. We're at 3 minutes past the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Leslie Hawthorn. I'm with Red Hat's Open Source Program Office and the Office of the CTO. And I am pleased tonight to welcome 3 folks who I've known for a very long time, all of whom are accomplished community builders, software developers, legal eagles, and who are either sole proprietors or principals of their own consulting practices. So we're going to talk today about advice for folks who are interested in getting started in open source consulting, some of the challenges of being a consultant, trends that these folks are seeing in their own consulting practices, and we'll also hopefully have some time at the end for Q&A in the chat tool. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Sumana, Aaron, and James. And I'm going to go ahead and let each of them introduce themselves and a little bit about their consulting practice. Sumana, would you mind starting first?
Sure. My name is Sumana Harihareswara, and I'm the founder of Changeset Consulting, which I started about 5 years ago. And I focus on short-term targeted project management in open source and free software projects. And what that means is, I think my point of view about a particular gap that we have in the industry as a whole is maintainership, the skill of being an open source maintainer, which is actually somewhat distinct from some of the skills that people have who end up being maintainers, being thrust into those positions, right? Like lead developer or architect or something like that. In the world, I think a lot of the people who have been listening to this series have been thinking about sustainability, right? And the different ways that sometimes usage and the criticality of a piece of software is actually completely independent of the level of investment that is happening in it. And in the great gap, right, of projects that are important but have no one particular institution that's really taken on the job of stewarding them, there's a bunch of glue code, legacy software, and other really important stuff that has often gotten a little bit stagnant and gotten stuck. It's gotten stuck in some way, and it's stuck in the same way that a car might get stuck by the side of the road or something like that because just, it's run out of gas or something. And my experience is a lot of those gaps, a lot of the problems that cause a project to get stuck aren't about the technical capability of the programmers involved or something like that. This is maintainership. This is leadership. This is product management. This is thinking about sales and customer support and documentation and release management and things like that. And so those are what Changeset brings to the table. And the short-term part of what I do is that an organization can pay me and I talk to the volunteers, right, mostly working on an open source project, and I say, do you mind if I help you out with all the stuff that's holding you back? And then me and my team can come together to get the next release out, rewrite docs, get rid of all those non-reproducible bugs in the bug tracker, talk with those volunteers about what a sustainable roadmap would look like, the release cadence that actually makes sense for them. And then, my team leaves, right? You're not giving me the keys to the kingdom forever. This is a model that when I came into my consulting practice in 2015, seemed completely lacking in the industry. And I think there's room for probably 8 to 10 of these, right? There's so much work that needs doing. And I'm hoping, right, to see more and more competitors and peers as we go forward, because I think this work needs doing. And I would say that I really appreciate the breadth of experience, right, that I'm going to talk about later that brought me to this point, but also I hope that people can see that even if you aren't necessarily going to work with me, the idea that maintainership is its own set of skills that is fungible across projects and that is not necessarily dependent on somebody being a lead developer would be useful to you in projects that you care about or work with.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Aaron, over to you, please.
Thank you, Leslie. My name is Aaron Williamson. I am an attorney with my own practice advising a wide range of clients on open source and other issues related to software and information technology. So I work with startups. I work with large companies that are either using a lot of open source software or publishing their own open source projects. I also work with a lot of nonprofit foundations. I help set them up and I advise them on governance issues. I spent a few years not too long ago as general counsel for the FinTech Open Source Foundation, which is a trade association of financial services firms working on open source software together. And it was a small foundation team, and my role there really overlapped into the sort of nonprofit and open source project governance quite a bit as well. So I sort of move back and forth between consulting on actual, legal issues and sort of community governance issues. So occupy that sometimes awkward position in the middle of things. I will stop there.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. James, over to you, please.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm James. I'm a partner at OpenTech Strategies. We're a open source consulting firm that does kind of a broad range of things, all focused on how you can get the most out of your open source investment. So sometimes that means helping with development. I mean, we do open source development. We help try to make other people's development better. But a lot of times it really is just about the way you go about doing your open source, right? It's the strategy for why are you doing open source? What is it supposed to change in your ecosystem? And how do you actually get those dynamics and get those effects? There's a lot of people doing open source out there, and some of them are doing it well, and some of them are doing it, making that investment, but not actually getting what they bargained for, not actually getting what they hope to get out of it. So a large part of what we do is trying to help our clients figure that out, right? To be more effective at it and actually get those results. So we do trainings, we have a support desk, the missing open source support desk that everyone seems to want. We've been providing that for a number of clients. And everywhere we go, this kind of sense that everything is changing. Open source is moving throughout the tech industry, and it's taking over more and more spaces. Everyone seems to have done it once, maybe. Everyone seems to have seen it at least, engaged it at least. And so our job is to take that engagement and make it more sophisticated. Actually take it from I've seen it once or twice to I really understand how this works, what the different types of open source are, and how to approach it to get what I need out of it. And our clients range. Our clients include companies like Microsoft and Hewlett Packard, nonprofits like the Red Cross, agencies like the United Nations, government agencies at every level. So the work we do is really focused on trying to figure out what open source means in these different spaces and how you apply it to achieve whatever your mission goals are or your market goals are. And that's really going to vary. And so we try to bring a broad-based expertise accumulated over years of having worked in this area and apply it to new situations. So that's what we do. And I will drop a link to my thing in the chat, just like Sumana did. I think that's great. And just like Aaron did. Thank you.
Actually, I think Sumana beat you to it, but that's great because we are all friends. Thank you very much for those excellent introductions, folks. So one of the reasons why I was really excited to convene this particular set of panelists is because all of you have these incredibly eclectic backgrounds. You've done so many different things, right, that I think inform your practice and also have informed the many conversations that we've had together, over time at various events. Sumana, you've done software development, you've done technical writing, you've done project management. James, you spent some time as a lawyer, you've spent some time as a nonprofit board member. Aaron, you've also, as you mentioned earlier, worked on contributor and governance policies. So I'd love to hear from each of you whatever you'd like to share on how those different things that you've done in your life have helped to inform the service that you provide to your clients. And if you think it's been valuable having those eclectic backgrounds to be able to better serve your customers.
Sure, I can go first.
Please.
So one of the things that I think you'll hear, right? You'll hear when people talk about the tech industry is, well, at some point, it doesn't matter whether you have any degrees or credentials or where you went to college or what you went to undergrad for or something like that. And I don't know whether that's entirely true. I think sometimes things have an effect, but I will tell you that one of the ways that I demonstrate to people that there is some amount of truth in this is that my bachelor's degree is in political science. And I use those lenses, right, of thinking about power and governance and stuff like that on a fairly regular basis. And I think that being able to come from the kind of social sciences lens of looking at a situation that involves a lot of people, right, and different power structures, and thinking, all right, what lens works for understanding this is helpful. Another thing that I think is really helpful is that before I started my own consultancy, I'd worked in a big variety of kinds of situations and environments, right? I had worked at a nonprofit, the Wikimedia Foundation, that stewarded a large, important, and therefore somewhat slow-moving open source project. I'd also done a little bit of work with, and sometimes on a volunteer basis, right, with smaller open source projects that moved really fast. I had been part of one of those 20-person web dev and information architecture consulting firms that I think everyone in the tech industry should have to work in for a year, just to kind of get a sense of the whole software development lifecycle, how to deal with clients and things like that. And so I'd worked in things having to do with government, nonprofit, for-profit, small organizations, startups, bootstrap, and I think that variety really, really helped me. Another thing that I think is useful is I grew up in a family where it was just expected that you would write a lot and publish things. My parents published a magazine, they edited anthologies. I did stand-up comedy from the time that I was kind of young. And so the ability to stand up now virtually, right, in front of a crowd and say what I was thinking or to write something was not a particularly new thing that I had to learn how to do. So I have this idea that I call no big deal theory, which is if you're a parent or an employer, or you somehow have some responsibility for the growth of someone who depends on you, if you can help them try things in a situation where even if they don't do great, it's no big deal, you're giving them such a wonderful opportunity to grow that skill and to grow confidence and to not feel intimidated by something that other people might feel intimidated by. So all of those things have helped me to get where I am.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sumana. If neither of you wishes to jump in.
I'm happy to talk about this next. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Aaron.
So as I mentioned, I'm a lawyer. I also, so in my undergraduate, I studied computer science, and I spent a few years, actually, I guess I'll say a couple of years as a software developer before I went to law school, having quickly decided for reasons that are not clear even to me, that this ain't it about software development full time. So I became a lawyer shortly after, and I won't say I was ever a very skilled software developer during my professional time doing it, but it's something that I continued to do as a hobbyist, and to get involved in small scale open source development even while I was in law school, and as I was a practicing lawyer after law school. I had the fortune of working for a very unusual organization, the Software Freedom Law Center, just out of law school, and we were sometimes encouraged and certainly allowed to spend some time on technical flights of fancy that related to our work there. So in that role, for example, I wrote a script that crawled GitHub for license statements and did a report on how many projects up on GitHub had no open source license associated with them. It was very kludgy and took a whole lot of time, and other people have done it better since. But my technical background has definitely informed the work that I have done as a lawyer, and certainly I've found it helpful. I work with clients at a pretty technical level. Sometimes I talk directly to developers to try and understand sort of how they're putting software together, and therefore what's required from a license compliance perspective. So that's one area where the technical background is certainly helpful. I will say that it hasn't always felt like an advantage. Going into law school, I remember a lot of people saying, "Oh, wow, it must be really valuable having this computer science degree." There can't be many lawyers who are like that. And I sort of felt like going into law school, I'm well positioned to become a technology lawyer because of this background. And also, I have a background in writing as well. And I felt like I was a good writer going into law school. And I'll tell you what, I was quickly disabused of that notion when I encountered legal writing to persuade judges. It's a very different thing. And so, I think I had the experience that a lot of people have in sort of shifting career tracks that like suddenly you know nothing again. And I guess I would encourage anybody who's getting into who's considering making a move to something like consulting, that you're always starting from square one in a sense, and it's okay to have those humbling experiences and realize you're not quite who you thought you were, and to begin learning again. I also think a technical background sometimes hinders people who do the kind of work that I do. I see people who get far too wrapped up in technical details in analyzing legal concepts related to software. You see this a lot in the question of how copyleft licenses might apply to derivative works, et cetera. People want to get deep into the weeds on the specific interactions between components of software in a particular technology. And I sort of imagine these people going before an actual judge and realizing that their house of cards quickly falls when they encounter the facts on the ground. But by and large, I found it quite helpful in my practice.
That was a very gracious exploration of the topic too, Erin.
Leslie, yeah, sorry, I know James, you'll be going next, but I wanted to mention some things that you reminded me of, Erin, that I wanted to mention, which is one, the way that having a different perspective that is not a programming centric perspective can be really helpful. So when I do my job on a project, a very common thing that I have to do is look at a giant bug tracker, right, that has hundreds of bugs, and start sorting through those and triaging them and cleaning up the tracker so that everything in there is something that's currently happening and is reproducible. If my primary interest in our industry was as a programmer, I would so often feel tempted to start actually trying to resolve those bugs, right? I would feel a pull and an urge to start working on that individual contributor level. But in my experience in our industry, we have an oversupply of programmers who want to write classes and functions relative to an undersupply of people who have the skill and the will to do the project management work. And so it's a little bit easier, for me to do the thing that I'd like to. Also, that I think needs to be concentrated on. But also I wanted to mention, Erin, what you said about feeling a bit at sea at the very beginning, right, of starting the consulting journey. I should mention that I think one of the things that was helpful for me in starting my own consultancy was that it wasn't my first time working in consulting. I had previously worked, I had done a tiny bit of freelancing several years before, but in addition, I had worked at multiple consulting organizations, one of which was the 20-person web dev shop that I mentioned, but another of which was Collabora, which is an open source centric consultancy based out of England, where I worked about 10 years ago. And so I think that gave me a little bit more of the knowledge and the muscle memory that helped me out when, there were inherent things that I had to start doing from scratch, like, get a LLC set up and figure out how I was going to do accounting and things like that. But if you're starting to think about this journey, if you can start by possibly subcontracting or even working as an employee for a little while with another consultancy that has a bunch of that stuff set up, then that could be a good on-ramp.
Excellent. Thank you, James. Go ahead.
So my background is also in political science as my undergraduate degree. I did poli-sci, I did economics. I also went to law school like Aaron, and I never took I think I took one programming class in high school. I've done a lot of coding over the years just because I'm interested in it, and we run a dev shop, so I get involved in projects sometimes. But I'm not here to be a rock star coder. That's not my job, and I'm not trying to displace anyone who is, right? We have plenty of really good developers who do that. Consulting is not about that. Consulting is really around all the stuff that happens around the code. And there's a tendency in open source projects to kind of put the developers first and at the center and treat them like first order participants and treat everyone else like some kind of faceless support cast. And the strong technical teams have really good developers, but they treat everybody involved in getting that software out the door like the crucial participants that they are. The best teams don't do that kind of weird overprivileging of the dev team. So when I've been throughout my career in hiring roles, I've always looked for people who have the ability to really understand the technical stuff, as Sumana does, as Aaron does, but I'm not looking for them to produce it. I'm looking for them to understand it and then do things with that understanding that makes the entire team do better. You know, when I worked with Aaron, his writing was great. That's one of the main reasons I wanted to work with him. That's one of the main things I enjoyed about working with him, was that he was a very strong writer. And you could throw all the technical stuff at you and he would manipulate it as concepts, but he wasn't sitting there trying to solve technical problems. That's just not what his role was. And so if there are people on this call who are looking to get into this end of things, there are so many opportunities for folks who understand the strategy, the reasons why we do open source, the dynamics around what it does to the relationships between different parties in an ecosystem, the way it enables companies that are competing with each other to cooperate. That kind of understanding is much less common than the understanding of how to participate in an open source project. We have a lot of people now who are pretty good at getting on GitHub and doing the thing on GitHub and effectively collaborating across boundaries, all kinds of boundaries. We have too few people who really understand why that is so powerful at a level beyond just making good code. And so I'm really excited to sort of talk to all kinds of people with a range of backgrounds. I mean, when I was working on a daily basis with Sumana, it was that brain, that ability to understand the development process and why it mattered at every stage. You know, she'd be like, this is what we're going to do, and why we're going to do it that way was a big piece of it. If you don't have the why, you don't know what to do. And so I always try to, when I can, take the opportunity to work with people who understand that why. And that why is very rarely going to come down to lines of code. It's always going to come down to the context in which that code is produced and run and deployed. It's never going to be about, you know, writing the perfect SQL statement.
I appreciate very much, James, your kind praise. I want to kind of bet that back at you and mention a little while ago, I wanted to get better at writing grant proposals because some of the organizations that want to work with me are nonprofits that don't have that much money and would be able to do this fairly important work much better if they could get some money for it. So, okay, I'll do a little bit of upfront gratis sales work of writing the grant proposal. And then if we get the grant, then I'm going to get paid out of that. And I asked James about how to get better at this. And he helped me understand how much of it is the why, right? Is the sales part of understanding, okay, the funding organization, treat them just like you would a client that you're trying to pursue and understand what do they want? Why would they possibly want for this project to succeed or reach some new capability or something like that? So, and yeah, it's definitely a lot easier to think on that strategic, managerial, executive level if you're already partly there, as opposed to that being like the first time you have to think about that stuff.
That is an amazing business development pathway that I had never considered, Sumana. Like, sorry, another friend of mine is writing grants for farms right now, so I have grant writing on the brain. So thank you for that insight. Heading back to open source software, I'm curious just to understand from you folks, like what trends you're seeing in terms of the consulting you're being asked for. Is there something that clients are asking for now that they have not in the past, or any particular, you know, something that used to be asked for all the time and now it seems like everyone's got it?
So one thing I've noticed is that a lot of the mainstream tech firms have decided they know how to do open source. Some of them are right about that. Some of them are less right about that. But they're not going to come to me and ask me how to run an open source project. They might come to me and say, can you provide some extra help around the edges or whatever. But the core of how do we participate? How do we send bugs upstream? That kind of stuff. There's a lot of folks that believe they have that down. And what's needed in those companies is not the coaching their development team on how to collaborate in open source ways. It's all the other strategy stuff. Outside of the tech world, though, outside of the companies that have always considered themselves tech companies, there is another set of companies that are tech companies. They're just only realizing it now, or they're only realizing how much tech they need. Those folks, they haven't done it once. Their team does not consist of people who have done it once. Their team consists of a lot of people who have heard of open source but never actually touched it. Maybe they've downloaded some libraries at some point, and maybe one person on the team who has a little bit more familiarity. And so they're generalizing from a sample size of n equals 1, and they're getting a lot of stuff wrong, right? So if you're looking for clients, the tech companies have one sort of need, which is strategy. The next set of clients out there, all the companies that are very much using the technology and big enough to be making technology, they have the full range of needs, including the basic boot camp of how do we go from we've never done this to the skill is generally distributed among our team. And so that's the thing that I've noticed in the last couple of years is just the shift in what's needed, right? And if you look at the finance sector is moving in a tech direction, and Aaron can speak more to this than I can, but they're tremendously behind the skill curve compared to the more traditional tech companies. And that's just one example. I mean, you could do that for every sector you look at.
Yeah, absolutely. My current work at Red Hat really focuses on engaging with market verticals, and it is amazing to me to see the number of folks who in my work in the open source program office just come to us for very basic education on how open source works because they have never encountered it before, and they really just don't know how to get started in their first steps for things that I think we're used to taking for granted. Did you have anything else you wanted to add, James?
No.
Excellent. Aaron, how about you? Any trends that you're seeing?
Absolutely. In your So I will jump off of James's comment about the finance sector, because that is, and as Dave said in the chat, this happens eventually with every sort of traditional industry. That the industry will start waking up to the fact that they are consuming a tremendous amount of open source software, and probably have been distributing in their products open source software for some amount of time, and have absolutely no process or no way of getting a handle on what their obligations are, how their use of open source software affects the security of their products, et cetera. And so they start to sort of look for the knowledge that they need and start to build the competency that they need eventually to form an open source program office that will manage every aspect of open source within their organization, from basic understanding of what they're using to compliance to open source strategy. And I've been intimately involved in, sort of shepherding this process in the financial services sector. I've run a group called the Open Source Readiness Working Group for Finos, the organization that I mentioned I was general counsel at, where we sort of held biweekly sessions to introduce our members to topics that are relevant to building an open source program office and just sort of understanding open source from a strategy and a process and a compliance standpoint. And that's been going on for, I think, 4 years now. And still there's a tremendous amount of hunger for that kind of information. And over that period of time, large financial services industry participants have gone from having nobody assigned to open source, even sort of part-time, to having entire offices dedicated to this. And in the process, a lot of them have hired outside consultancies as well. And so, that's a trend in that industry, but it's also a broader sort of trans industry trend that eventually every single traditional industry will wake up to their open source obligations and the idea that they need an open source strategy. I will say the other trend that I'm seeing is, since I do work with open source nonprofits, I see a trend toward forming independent foundations again. I think that there was a period of sort of a trend toward consolidation in existing fiscal sponsors, from the Linux Foundation to the Software Freedom Conservancy, Apache Software Foundation to some extent. And so, folks were sort of trying to cite corporate collaborations in existing entities, and now I see it's becoming more common that these collaborations are not finding a fit with some of those organizations and are interested in making their own independent foundation. And sometimes that may be a good move, and sometimes it may be a bad move, but regardless, a foundation is rarely going to start out with the internal capacity it needs for everything that a foundation does, from all of the back office stuff to, as Sumana said, project managing open source projects and et cetera, producing documentation. So, that's an area where I see an opportunity for open source consultants to get a lot of new business, is just these organizations that have no internal capacity for a lot of the things that they ultimately will need.
Excellent. Thank you, Aaron. Sumana, trends that you're seeing.
Yeah, I am pasting something into the chat. By the way, there's a bunch of interesting conversation happening in the chat as well. I would say two things that I see as trends right now in the industry have to do with open source sustainability and the desire for diversity and inclusion related consulting and improvement. So it's been years since Nadia Eghbal wrote the Roads and Bridges report about how we rely on so much infrastructure that isn't getting enough upkeep. And now we've seen, as an outcome of all of those conversations and of the underlying problem, a number of efforts like Tidelift. We see the rise of Open Collective. We see a lot more work being done with an effort. I think there's been more research being funded by, Sloan and Ford and Moore and so on about these problems. And so now, instead of, this open source project is not sustainable, what could be done? The question becomes more among people who've been paying a bit of attention. Okay, in order to improve the sustainability of this project, which of these paths should we follow? And how do we persuade people to let money get into the mix of something that perhaps previously was all volunteer, and so on and so on. So, and even the work that I've been doing, right, in writing grant proposals, it is only possible because there are funders who are funding that work, right? Like Mozilla, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and so on. So that is something that's an interesting trend, and I hope that it continues, right? I think that this is one of the ways that the industry that has made money off of open source software can invest in the continuing security and reliability of that infrastructure in a variety of different ways, right? By funding things in a, as I think of it, systematic paying the maintainers of all of its infrastructure through something like Tidelift, or in more targeted ways, like I think what Indeed has been doing with these directed monthly, okay, we're going to give money to some project that we depend on, that people voted on internally, or something like what Bloomberg just did, paying part of the cost for my team to work on AutoConf. And I'm pasting a link in the chat there. Second, on the diversity and inclusion front, a lot of us have come to understand that if we want to do the best that we can as teams, we need to make sure that we're welcoming everybody and not excluding, hopefully accidentally, people who bring different perspectives. And so that's led to, and of course the desire for just better press and PR, right, has led to, okay, let's have fewer awful incidents. Let's make sure we're welcoming people. Okay, how do we do that? Let's have codes of conduct. Let's do recruiting. Let's do participation in projects like Outreachy, the paid apprenticeship program to help new people get into open source from marginalized backgrounds, and so on and so on. And So there's a desire for more diversity and inclusion consulting. And I see sometimes people come to me, especially since I am a woman and I'm a person of color, and I have been involved with diversity and inclusion initiatives in open source in the past. And people would like for me to sometimes do work with them, sometimes in hiring on open source projects that are funded, and say we'd like to get more diverse pool of applicants. Sometimes it's that they'd like code of conduct related work or training or governance work that intersects with code of conduct work or something like that. And I tend to refer these folks to Sage Sharp at OtterTech, but this is another place where there's room for more consultancies probably. And I think that one of the issues that you run into with that is people want, anytime sensitive topics like this come up, right, people feel a lot of desire to work with someone who has a lot of credibility, because someone could do a lot of harm by either giving bad advice or simply being associated with somebody, right? So anyway, those are some of the trends that I see.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. One thing that I wanted to note that I found to be very surprising, especially if there are folks who are considering getting into consulting, and diversity and inclusion is an area where they are excited to contribute and work with clients. We're working on a project called The Open Source Way, which is sort of an upstream guidebook for community management best practices. And one of the chapters in the book is focused on mental health care. So we engaged with a mental health care professional to review the material in this chapter, because we wanted to make sure that we had done the appropriate thing when we are dealing with people's minds. And what she noted to us was that actually she was deeply pleased with how sophisticated, well-written, and useful the tools that open source communities had put together in terms of codes of conduct, and actually working to spell out, rules for engaging within communities. Because, in her profession, in the practice of psychology and going to events about psychology, they were not as far evolved as she was seeing in open source communities. So if this is something where people are excited to get involved, it turns out that the open source community is at the forefront of this kind of work to help us all be able to engage with each other more effectively, and to, put out rules. I call it rules of engagement. That sounds so martial, but, rules of engagement for us all working together in a useful way. All right, if we are ready, we can move on to our next question. So what are some of the challenges that you face being either, like Erin, you're a sole proprietor, or working with small teams as you're building your consulting practice? James, I'm going to pick on you because you look very serious right now.
Sure. The staffing is tough when you're running a small operation, because you want to sort of always have people at the ready to say yes to things, but you're not big enough that you can afford to pay people to sit around, right? So having the right amount of staffing is always a problem. And one thing I said to Sumana early on when she was just getting going, and I think this is advice I would give anyone, is start building that team early, even before you have more work than you yourself can handle. Bring in other people to help you with it, because you're going to need to grow their capabilities. You're going to need to make sure that you work well with them, and then eventually you want to be able to hand them things and let them go do it without your constantly looking over their shoulder. And you can't do that if it's your first time working with them. So I always say start early, with kind of gathering that team, figuring out who those go-to people are that you're going to hand certain kinds of work, and recognize that they're going to float in, they're going to float out. Be willing to make deeper commitments when that's the right thing to do, but start relatively soon to build that network.
One of the things James mentioned to me, I remember at some point when we were talking together about open tech strategy stuff and growing, was that every consultancy feels like the perfect staff size would be one more than where they currently are, right? Because that's what you feel. You feel, oh, if I had one more person, I could take this gig, I could take that gig, right? I could do it well. And I think that the challenge of maintaining your warm contacts with, that sort of permanent floating pool of freelancers is something that the publishing industry knows about, right? In the publishing industry, there's always sort of this permanent floating pool of freelance editors, copy editors, or copywriters, and production assistants, and so on. And one thing that I've run into is I bring somebody on and I kind of train them the way that I'd like, and then they go and get a full-time job and they're not available anymore, right? So you really have to keep the conveyor belt going. I also find that during COVID, during the pandemic, it's harder that as a small shop, I don't get to see people in person. So much of my work is remote, but for a while, I actually co-worked with James a fair amount in New York City. We would see each other often, a few times a week at a co-working space in New York City. And I want to thank James for setting that up. That was a really wonderful moment. To me, now it feels like this golden past era where the fact that, and I've tried a variety of working from home and co-working experiences over the past, right? I've worked at an in-person office. I've done co-working in just sort of a standard rent a desk for a month kind of place, all sorts of stuff. And there's something really useful about going someplace every day where even if you're not absolutely working on the same thing, you know the same stuff. You come at things from the same perspective. You can bounce around ideas. If I could start over again as a sole, I'm the founder, I'm the owner of Changeset Consulting LLC. And as I was starting out, I could think of a couple of people that I would be interested in starting with, co-founding with. And neither of them was in New York City. And I thought, okay, well, then I won't do that. I'll wait and see if there's someone I end up wanting to partner with in New York City and then, bring them on after. And in retrospect, I think it would have been better to initiate that conversation and potentially co-found with them anyway, even though it would have been remote, because we still would have had that flywheel of daily momentum, of mutual accountability, of being able to offload things and stuff like that. On by the way, the side of the sort of finding freelancers and things like that, I have a spreadsheet that I try to keep updated of people who I'm pretty sure that I could work well with, or I've worked well with in the past in some capacity, volunteer, contract, and we were both employees at the same place, whatever. And if something looks like it's coming down the pipe, I ping them. And I am interested in seeing if there could be a little bit more sharing of that among all of us small consultancies.
Okay. James, do you want to give a shout out for your Zulip watering hole for folks who are doing consulting? So maybe we can use that as a place to gather folks who are interested. You're on mute, friend.
Thank you. We run a Zulip instance, thanks to Sumana, actually, that is kind of the place where we are doing all of our corporate real-time communication. It's at chat.opentechstrategies.com, and we've opened it up. We don't shout about it a lot, but it's actually a public instance that anyone is welcome to use for any sort of free and open source software purposes. A bunch of our clients use it, a bunch of our colleagues use it, and if that's interesting to you as a place to gather, as a place to chat with people, we encourage the gathering of community there, especially the gathering of the portion of the community that is built around this kind of consultancy stuff, this kind of servicing the sector, not at a development level, at a tech level, but at a strategy and business level. So come on by. We'd love to see you. If you do hop in that chat, say hi to us. Feel free to make a room. We encourage not just people coming in with the kinds of business-oriented questions that you might expect, but we actually really like it when people hang around and get a little bit chatty, because that's how you start to build community. That's how you actually start to have the social permission to then talk about bigger things and more important things. And so come on by. Everyone is more than welcome. Certainly if you're interested enough that you're listening to this stream, you more than qualify for coming by. And if you do, definitely say hi.
Thank you. Aaron, do you have anything to add on challenges that you're facing as a sole proprietor?
Yeah, I mean, like both of these others, it can be really difficult to, to sort of have the right set of people around you as a sole proprietor to, hand off or to, easily on a moment's notice. Certainly, I deal with the issue of, people come to me with legal issues that are not really within my area of speciality. And so, I sort of have collected, my spreadsheet is only in my mind at this point, but I really should put it into bits like Sumana has, but, of people who are practicing in different states and countries in areas that sort of are adjacent to mine, who I can refer work to. I think a big temptation when you get started out in solo practice or in having a small consultancy is sort of trying to hoard work, and taking everything that comes in the door and sort of trying to just expand your scope to fit the work that's coming in, because you're sort of afraid you're not going to have enough work. But I found that the more I sort of turn down work that is not really within the core of my expertise, and instead hand that off to somebody who I trust, who can do that work, the better scoped my work is, and and it has not resulted in a reduction of work. In fact, it usually eventually ends with referrals back from the people that I'm handing that work off to. And I have not been in a position of actually subcontracting anyone yet. I do see myself getting to the point of wanting to hire probably a junior attorney at some point in maybe the next year. But right now it's entirely about referring the work out to somebody else who will get that fee. But it has not hurt me one bit, and I recommend doing it early and often.
Oh yeah, I've done so much referral, and I love it. I love helping other people up. Yep.
I actually think that's one of the really interesting things that came up as we were preparing for this panel, and also just some discussions I've had with other folks who are working in the open source consulting space, how there's really this lack of sort of a spirit of competition amongst consultancies, right? Everyone is handing each other clients, everyone's handing each other opportunities, and everyone is consistently sending the same message. We need more folks doing this work, not less. I need more help.
And I want to mention, sorry to interrupt, Leslie. I think part of that is, okay, so marketing, right? In order to market to clients, they need to actually understand what need they have. And having more consultants so that we can kind of spread out the work of doing the marketing, so that through our networks and through the existing client work that we do, and then word of mouth from that and past results, if more and more potential clients could even come to understand the need that they have and the kinds of work that is available that they could pay us to do, that's better for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so folks, I just want to be conscious of time. We have a couple of audience questions, but I would like us to address the last of our prepared questions, because I think it's very important for folks who may attend, who are attending live, or who may see the playback. Really quick sound bites, please. What advice do you have to people who are just getting started in with open source consulting, or who are interested in going down that path? And James, I know you had a great answer, so I'm going to look at you first, sir.
I don't remember what my great answer was. You want to give me a hint?
Want to talk about how Open Tech Strategies may be looking for some junior folks to join your organization?
Yes, we are looking for people. We just got a bunch of consulting work in the front door, and it's more than we can do, and we're definitely looking for people who are interested in doing it. If you have been around the open source block a few times and you have strong writing skills, definitely reach out to me. I will drop my email in the chat. And if you don't want to work for a firm, you want to be on your own, but you want to start doing this work, you should also reach out to me, because I'd be happy to talk to you. I remember when Sumana was launching Changeset, and I said, well, maybe instead of doing that, you should just come work for OTS full time. And she said no. She said, no, I want to do my own thing. And I thought that was a great answer, and I'm always happy to see her succeed. And if you come to me with that same sort of proposition, you don't want to work for me, but you want to do it on your own, I'm likewise excited to see that happen. So drop me a line.
Great. Thanks so much, James.
I'm happy to go next. So Ash Dryden wrote a sort of plain language contract that I've heavily modded, and that's my default contract that I use with clients. If you're like, oh, but how do I even do that? Like, I'm happy to share mine with you. There's also 2 lawyers on the call who might be able to share better language. I am writing a book on what I would consider brownfield open source maintainership, right? You're coming into a legacy project and you need to help it level up. So I'm working on that right now. Feel free to contact me if you are interested in reading some early drafts and maybe giving me some feedback. If you email me, and my contact is on the Changeset website, that would be great. I also want to tell you really briefly, I got some great advice when I was first starting out from Melinda Byerly, who's the timeshare CMO, on initial client contact. Basically, the moment that someone starts talking to you about maybe we'd like to work with you, as soon as you can say, let's have a call. And let's have it be a half-hour call with all of the people who are important to have, deciding whether or not the contract would happen and just specifying what the project would be. So then in that call, that's free. You do that for free, right? And you listen. At the end of that call, you say, all right, great. I'm going to send you a draft work, of what the work would be. The work plan. And so then you send them, maybe you send them 2 or 3 options, right? Sort of like bare bones, adequate, and deluxe, and what the basic, price range would be. And then you sit back, right? You've said to them, here's what some engagements could be that we could do together and what they might cost. And maybe you send 1 follow-up email, maybe 2, but you don't chase it. Right. And now this is a way that you lock out the possibility that they will just sort of endlessly drag on and kind of get a bunch of free consulting out of those conversations with you. And I have found that to be a pretty helpful guide.
Awesome. Thank you. Aaron, anything to add?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. If somebody does not want to work with you in the way that you think is best to work, going chasing after that because you're afraid of letting the bird escape is just going to be a recipe for misery. I've found that the more that I sort of just have the initial consultation, and if they're not ready to engage, I'm not going to go after it, because usually it will be more grief than it's worth. Another thing I will say about getting started is that, and to some degree, I understand how this can be kind of disheartening for people to hear, but it's who you know. Pretty much all of my work comes from referrals from people who I have worked with in the past, or who know me from the sort of open source and lawyer networks that I'm a part of. Obviously, you have to let them know that you are doing the work that you're doing. So a little bit of outreach to your networks is important. But I would not suggest spending a whole lot of time on marketing materials or search engine optimization, or making your website, really expensive and beautiful necessarily, so much as I would focus on, on getting out and talking to the people who know you and like working with you, and letting them know, what you do and how you're doing it. And I have found that I have gotten a lot of value out of writing for outlets that where people actually read. Blogging for yourself can be useful, but I've had a couple of pieces on opensource.com and in legal journals about technology, etc. And sort of doing high quality work for publications that actually get viewership has been really helpful for bringing in strangers. But most of my work comes through referrals from people I know.
Have you gotten any referrals from opensource.com writing?
I do think that I previously spent some time in private practice, and before I had my own consultancy, but I was a partner there as well. And I definitely had 1 or 2 folks who sort of saw my work there because they had been, Googling GPL lawyer.
I would say that one thing to keep in mind is that, at least in my firm, and I'd be curious to hear about the other folks on this call, the sales process is very long. I can have an initial conversation and not actually have a contract in hand for 18 months easily. Happens all the time, and sometimes even longer. It is sometimes the case that people come to you and they know what they want and they're ready to rock, but most of the time when people come to you, it's because they don't know what they want. they don't have a well-specified problem. So there's a whole process where you have to help them understand what their problem actually is and what you can do for them. And sometimes our engagement is actually like, okay, you came to me with a problem, and the first engagement is me helping you figure out what your actual problem is. And so we do a very small first engagement, and then we do a larger one after that where we say, okay, now we know what problem we're trying to tackle, and now we can tackle it. But this process, boy, it's not quick. And so if you're going to be doing this, there's a lot of patience involved, and then there's a lot of just cash flow variance involved if you're running a firm, especially if you have to pay people. You'll often have to kind of pay people way before the money comes in. So, there's some practical considerations there. And if you're looking to get into this, you got to think some of those through.
I agree absolutely with the usefulness of like initial discovery engagements. Absolutely. However, I think that because there's so many different parts of this industry, there's parts of it where the work that is being done is pretty defined and people who show up actually know what they want. And I would say that, for instance, the kinds of stuff that OtterTech does on diversity and inclusion consulting, or the kind of work that I do, is much more on the, you don't have to do as much back and forth to figure out, well, what do we need out of this engagement? So there are ways to structure things a little bit more in that way, but it still takes time.
Okay, so folks, we are at the top of the hour, and I'm going to look for one question in chat, and then we might just do a quick round of final thoughts, if that's all right with you guys. Excuse me, with you lovely humans. Correct my inappropriate use of language. How about from Dave? I'm not choosing your question simply because you are our fabulous moderator, so I'm going to look farther along in the audience. From Amir Montezeri, how often does security come up in conversations regarding open source software, and what seems to be the consensus around that discussion?
It comes up. It comes up less often than it used to. The security scaremongering around open source has largely faded. I mean, it's still there here and there. People still believe in security by obscurity in a lot of places, but it's no longer you face a team of people where there's one person and that's the drum they're going to beat loudly in every conversation. So I wouldn't say it's as big a deal as it used to be. And we now have an awful lot of open source security focused work with a pretty good track record that you can point to. And usually there's ways to have that conversation, right? There's tons of experts in security who work in the open source sector. We have people on our team, on our dev team, who are pen testers, who know how to do it, and they can have that conversation directly with a company's security team, with their dev team. So you kind of want to hit that head on and realize that people might have some preconceived notions, and you just marshal the evidence and present it. And what happens next is really up to your client. But it has not been a blocker in an engagement for me for a few years now.
Great. Aaron, Sumana, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think security is, on the one hand, a very important topic, particularly when I'm working with clients who are, they're looking for help with open source compliance, right? There's always, on the one hand, there's license compliance, on the other hand, security compliance. And if there's somebody who needs to be convinced to put money into building open source competence within a large company, then, I always counsel the people I'm talking to are usually not that person, to lead with the security point. Open source software is not inherently less secure, but if you have a whole lot of open source and you're never updating it, then your software as a whole is insecure, because software needs to be updated to remain secure. And so, figuring out what open source you're using is the first step toward complying with the open source licenses and the first step towards securing your products. And so that's usually the context in which I like to, in which security comes up most for me.
So, anything you want to
add? So there's various words where if you say them, sometimes people stop thinking a bit. It's like a way to almost short circuit the conversation. I read recently that one of those words is uncomfortable. Like if you say I'm uncomfortable with that, then it's like, at least in some cultures and contexts, Now everybody has to route around that, and no one is allowed to ask you why, which is an interesting little hack. But one of those words is security. Leslie, yes?
I'm just thinking of how often I use the word uncomfortable to route around difficult situations. Sorry, please continue.
Yeah,
one of the words is security. Thank you, ma'am.
So it's cool. It's cool. I just learned someone writing about that specifically as an aspect of white culture recently, and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. So security, right, is another word that can be like that, and you can use that to your advantage, right, as a consultant. If I'm trying to get people to care about upgrades, I look through the change log, right? And I find things that have any kind of security aspect to them. And I say, here's why you need to upgrade, right? And at least, sometimes it's easier to get funding to do stuff if you can say, look, there's a security aspect to it. So sometimes that, can absolutely be misused, but that's the context in which I really run into it is I know that there are absolutely real cybersecurity threats that exist. I have some amount of power to do some things about them versus not. And I will notice when there is some need that a user has, that a funder, a client might have, or a thing that they perceive as having value. And I will mention it if I'm trying to persuade them to do something. I'm never going to lie. I'm never going to, I hope, be misleading, but I'm going to notice, okay, there's a thing here that you're really going to care about, and I'll bring that forward. That's just smart communication.
Yeah, very cool. All right, so one sentence, please, from each of you, whatever else wisdom you would like to deliver to the audience. Sumana, I'm going to ask you first, please.
It is a really good moment right now to show gratitude out of nowhere and to send notes to people where you explicitly say that there is no obligation to reply, but that you appreciate them and you mention specifically why. Right now, when we have so much less just day-to-day ambient existence around other people, we aren't getting all those tiny little, I see you and acknowledge you as a person, and I'm glad that you exist, like vibes. So if you can pump a little bit more of that out into the people, the world of people that you care about, that would be great.
I think that's excellent advice at any time, and particularly now. Thank you so much for that. Aaron, anything you'd like to share?
I guess not to sound too much like a prosperity gospel preacher, but I found that if this is what you want to do, if open source consulting is what you want to do, and if you genuinely commit to doing it and sort of step out into that void, that the road tends to rise to meet you. And I've seen that with, everyone I know who is successfully doing this work. You don't necessarily have to have a huge cushion to get started on your consulting journey. It can be really scary to take that step, but if you're committed to it and you do it, I think it'll work.
Awesome, thank you. And James, anything you'd like to add?
I think I would just say that the power of open source is the power of the communities that it creates, and that is going to be true for your consulting practice as much as it is for your clients. And if you can build community and connection around the work that you do, and the primary way you do that is by helping other people, then you start to gather some momentum and you start to gather a community that returns energy to you in the form of knowledge, network, contacts, resources, help, whatever that is that you need. And that really is the only way to do it as far as I'm concerned. I don't see another successful set of people doing open source consulting work who aren't somewhat community minded and not just paying lip service to it, but actually working to try to better the communities that they are involved in. And so if that's the kind of person you are, I think you have a lot of success ahead of you. If that's not the kind of person you are, then I think you really need to consider whether this is the right path for you. And I've said this to a number of people. It's not for everybody, and it's okay if it's not for you. There are so many other jobs in open source and technology and beyond. There are so many other ways to be of value to the world and to help people. This doesn't have to be it. So, think about where this sits with you and how you feel about the track record you've created and where you're going with it, and build on your successes and improve on your failures, but do take a hard look at what you're capable of as a person and emotionally, because if you can bring that kind of energy, there's a lot out there for you.
Thank you. Aaron, James, Sumana, thank you so much for being our panelists today. This has been a fantastic session. Dave, I don't know if you'd like to rejoin and let folks know where they can find out about future episodes of our webcast.
Yes.
Hi, Dave.
Hi. Can you see me? There
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you to everybody for joining us today. I'm going to put the focus on myself. So our next week's episode is, and I should be better prepared than this, but next week we are going to be listening to Matt Klein. This is a really interesting topic, I think. So Matt AC is going to be interviewing Matt Klein on the topic of, oh no, that's later. Excuse me. Next week we have Stephen Wally interviewing Mike Milinkovic on the reinvention of the Eclipse Foundation. Now, the Eclipse Foundation has been around since 2001, but they've evolved over that time from starting around developer tooling to being a much broader organization now and having fingers in a lot of pies, including IoT and automotive and manufacturing. And they've recently announced that they're going to be moving to Europe. They're becoming a Belgian nonprofit. And so in the context of that move, and in the context of the evolution of the Eclipse Foundation from its foundation to now, Stephen and Mike are going to talk about some of the reasons why that has happened, and some of the impact in terms of the role of the Eclipse Foundation as a motor of an ecosystem of member companies, and the role that the foundation sees that it plays in the development of a business ecosystem around the projects that it curates. After that, we're taking a break for Thanksgiving, but we're back on December 1st with that session that I started to describe, which is guest host Matt AC, who will be interviewing Matt Klein around some of the reasons why, Matt is the author of a very, very popular project called Envoy, and has made a very conscious decision not to start a company around it, in spite of having lots and lots of pressure and offers of funding from people who want to invest in a startup around service mesh, specifically around Envoy. So Matt will talk to Matt about some of the reasons why he made that decision, and dig into a little bit of, because I think he's done some really interesting analysis of market design and what types of companies work for what types of projects. And I expect that to be a super interesting conversation about what you should be thinking of before you start a company around an open source project. So thank you very much, Leslie, Sumana, James, and Aaron. I really appreciated your shared wisdom here, and I will be getting this video up on YouTube a little bit later today, and it's available on demand immediately after we finish at this same URL. Next week's URL will be the same, except instead of OS Business 7, it will be OS Business 8. All of our sessions are up on the schedule page of our website, which is osbusiness.org. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Cheers.
Great.